Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We've got folks from all over the world joining us this morning, morning Eastern Time in the U.S. Welcome to 'Tis the Season for PSD2 SCA and getting ready for Holiday 2019. I'm Nick Belenke. I'm the Head of Merchant Partnerships here at CardinalCommerce. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Paul Harrison, the Head of Business Development, to get you guys started.
Thanks very much, Nick. How are you today?
Doing well.
Good. Today is September 25th, so 3 months to go until Christmas Day. Are you excited for Christmas?
I'm excited that we survived September 14th, and I'm just getting ready for the idea of the holidays coming up.
Okay, very good. Have you finished your list for Santa now?
I have hardly started, but thanks for reminding me.
Well, very good. Okay, well, I'm not going to go into the front fine print here, but as a notice of confidentiality, I should note that by accepting this presentation, you acknowledge the information is confidential and should not be used for any other purpose. So during this webinar, Nick and I will discuss how you, as a merchant, might want to prepare for this year's holiday shopping season to ensure any fraud impacting your digital commerce is minimized. While we summarize the outcome of the 2018 holidays, we will take a look at new market forces impacting this year. Finally, we'll discuss the benefits of using 3D Secure and moreover highlight what you should look for in a 3D Secure provider. We will, of course, leave sufficient time for some important questions that you might want to pose so that we can answer those. So we certainly encourage you to submit those questions through the FAQ box. If we don't have enough time to answer them during the webinar, we'll make sure that we get to those afterwards. So the holiday season is indeed the busiest and riskiest time of the year. As you're already likely aware, merchants are already preparing for the onslaught of transaction volumes and fraud attacks. Indeed, many merchants' websites have holiday freeze periods, so you really need to make sure you have all the preparation done well in advance. The holiday season is critical to your business. That's no surprise, as more consumers are placing more orders. But of course, fraudsters are more active during this time than at any other during the calendar year. Now, in Europe, retailers face a holiday sales period extending from the week of Black Friday and Cyber Monday. So that's starting November 22nd, and that runs through Christmas well into the following year. These extended sales periods can be particularly challenging for smaller retailers. Interestingly, observers are stating that while sales volumes are considerably higher during these sales events, profit margins are a lot lower. And hence, we're noticing a shift, of the strategic focus from profits to data. In other words, sales activities are now focused on attracting new customers with the best deals on products, and in turn gaining the data that comes with them. Of course, is highly valuable to retailers for long-term business planning. So let's take a look at the holiday season in Europe last year. While the end-of-year holiday period has always been a highlight of the shopping calendar in Europe, Black Friday and Cyber Monday, well, they're traditionally US shopping days, and they did not feature until recently. However, as of 2018, most consumers and retailers in Europe welcomed these discount days as big opportunities for business. The UK retailers were among the first in Europe to embrace the potential of Black Friday and Cyber Monday, and have likely influenced other European countries such as France, Spain, Germany, and Italy. And indeed, a study by EU payment specialist Clearhouse of some 8,000 online stores in 33 European countries estimates that the number of transactions on Black Friday 2018 was some 360% higher than the 2018 daily average. On Cyber Monday, transactions were 77% higher than the 2018 daily average, and 57% higher than Cyber Monday 2017. So in other words, participation in Black Friday and Cyber Monday has risen sharply in recent years, and as a result, retailers have enjoyed more sales. Okay, so that was looking back at 2018. Now, as far as authentication is concerned, this holiday season will be quite different, as there are other new forces in play. In addition to a continuous migration of transactions from card present to card not present, this year the new PSD2 requirement for strong customer authentication, or SCA, is going to be in play in Europe. Nick will speak about this in a moment. We do suggest that you also reference our demo website, demos.cardinalcommerce.com, for details about other mandates in the world beyond just PSD2. So again, that website is demos.cardinalcommerce.com. Now, this is also the first holiday shopping season that the EMV 3D Secure, that's the new generation of 3DS, will be in use. Though the existing 3DS 1.0 is still around, issuing banks are in the process of starting to run the new generation of EMV 3D Secure. So it's really a great time for merchants to take advantage of the benefits that are unique to this new version. So Nick will now speak in more detail about PSD2.
Thanks, Paul. So thanks for going into detail about the holiday season and some of the effects of the holiday season in terms of increase in volume and the susceptibility to fraud. Now I want to talk a little bit about what's different this year. You know, we could have had this conversation last year and the year before, but this year we've added a new wrinkle or a new fold to this to the discussion with PSD2. So PSD2 is the second payment service directive in Europe. It has a lot of parts to it that are relevant to the European marketplace, but in particular, the requirements for strong customer authentication are of consideration this year for the holiday season. Strong customer authentication, or SCA. You're going to hear a lot of SCA in this presentation. I'm sure you're going to hear about SCA in your business as well. It went into effect. The SCA requirement went into effect September 14th. Now, September 14th, like I mentioned before, obviously is behind us at this point. We anticipated this date for quite some time, and we're going to talk a little bit about what the current effects are and then what the sort of knock-on effects related to some of the enforcement actions against that September 14th date are a little bit later in this presentation. So let's talk a little bit about why SCA is part of the PSD2 directive. So SCA is essentially, think of it as two-factor authentication. You're looking for something that the consumer has, or something that the consumer knows, or something that the consumer is, and a combination of two of those factors in order to essentially protect the consumers that are using their cards for online, for digital card not present transactions. The point of this part of the directive for SCA is to enhance security, is to reduce credit card fraud, and essentially make consumers more comfortable using their credit cards for online transactions. And this directive covers the EEA, or the bulk of Europe. We're going to talk about that a little bit more as well. So SCA, PSD2, these are some of the acronyms that we're going to be using throughout this presentation. So what does SCA affect you? And that's really the question most merchants will have immediately is, okay, does this actually apply to my business? So there's a couple of questions that you need to answer. So first of all, let's define the group or the area where PSD2 is actually in effect. So the European Economic Area, or the EEA, is a group of 30-some countries in Europe. And so you're as a merchant, you don't have to actually be located in one of those countries, but you need to, if you're a merchant acquiring a bank is located in those countries, then you need to be thinking about PSD2 for sure. So you need to be able to find it, and if that's the case, you need to be thinking about finding an SCA solution for those transactions now, because we've passed the September 14th deadline. So there's two concepts to understand as to whether or not SCA is required for you for a specific transaction. First of all, there's a consideration of scope. Scope will let you know whether a transaction is even covered by SCA for PSD2. Covered in the sense of, is the merchant acquired? in Europe. That's one of the two major legs, so to speak, or tenets of SCA requirements. And the other is that the transaction is being performed with a credit card that is issued inside of the EEA. So if it's both, if the merchant is acquired in the EEA and the card is issued in the EEA, then it's considered to be two legs in, and that means that it's within scope for SCA. If one of those two doesn't exist, so for example, a card that's being used with a North American acquired merchant or a Pacific acquired merchant, even if it originates or is issued in Europe, that transaction is not in scope for PSD2 SCA. So there are other types of transactions that are not in scope for SCA as well. So even within the PSD2 directive, such as merchant-initiated transactions. So there's a lot of variety of merchant-initiated transactions, with the most common being a recurring transaction. So there's a lot of detail around how to implement around recurring transactions, but merchant-initiated transactions like certain utilities and certain recurring costs are not in scope. Certain corporate cards are not in scope, et cetera. There's another concept, though, that would make a transaction, while it's in scope, perhaps be exempt from the requirement of SCA, strong customer authentication. So these exemptions fall into three categories. Trusted beneficiaries, also known as whitelisting, allow a merchant to be added to a specific card holders or PANs list of merchants that the consumer is allowing them not to perform SCA on their transactions. Low value transactions, so the directive does include an ability with some rules around it, of course, for merchants not to run SCA for transactions under 30 euros. And then low risk transactions. So the opportunity exists for an issuer to run what's called TRA, or transaction risk analysis on a transaction, to determine whether or not they want to perform SCA. They have to meet very strict guidelines in order to be able to run TRA in terms of the total fraud levels inside of their portfolios. So all of these exemptions are important to understand, and I think that the takeaway point here is you have to really get into coverage for SCA before you can get out of it, which is to say every merchant that has two-leg-in transactions will need some sort of strategy for SCA. And then the question is, how many transactions are actually exempt versus not exempt in that portfolio? Okay, so I mentioned it before, I teased this a little bit, and one thing I keep talking about September 14th, but of course September 14th is behind us. And so you might wonder, okay, so what's happened in the last few weeks, and what's happening moving forward? Well, so there have been quite a few press releases recently and running up to the September 14th deadline, indicating delays for up to 18 months for actual enforcement of SCA. So to be very clear, the directive has definitely gone into effect, and then the question is, okay, so how is that directive enforced? Well, each individual country is its own enforcement agency, and as a result, they have issued different and separate press releases one after the other. So there's a lot of reasons that individual enforcement authorities may have decided to extend the enforcement deadline. So we've got issues around the complexity of the requirements, recent announcements of two-factor authentication being required across in really what comes up with which factors are included in two-factor authentication, lack of preparedness in the ecosystem, and ultimately it's going to be the expected impact on card not present purchases that have caused the enforcement authorities to issue these extensions. Most of the extensions for the countries that are extending are for 18 months and require a strict plan for each of the participants and PSBs that want an extension to be rolled out with an explanation of how they're going to meet the standard going down the road. So the recommendation doesn't change, however, because not every country has issued an extension. It's a changing landscape, and you've got the need for SCA for 3D Secure in the ecosystem anyway. So even though there are delays, and you hear a lot in the the environment, don't take that as a sign to stop implementing 3D Secure. In fact, it's an opportunity for it to be implemented properly and in the right way, in a complete way. We're going to talk about that a little bit more.
Right, and I don't think we can really overemphasize that, can we? And the fact that our recommendation is for merchants to go ahead and make those preparations now, because even if there is a delay for SCA coming into effect, there could be a benefit for them to have it anyway.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, that's a good point, Paul. It's the reason that SCA exists for PSD2 goes beyond just a legal requirement. It's great for the entire ecosystem, including the merchants that have to implement the service as well.
Yeah, and we'll be getting into a little bit about that, the benefits shortly.
Yeah, and it might be worth, if I'm asking you folks to take a look at implementing 3D Secure, we should probably take a moment and talk about 3D Secure, make sure that we're using the right terminology and everyone understands really what we're asking for. So 3D Secure technology has been around a long time. So the legacy version of 3D Secure is version 1.0. You've got 20 years of history under our belts for 3D Secure 1.0. It meets the compliance requirements, meaning it creates that connection between the consumer and the issuing bank that's required for that issuer to perform SCA, to perform two-factor authentication. It can make that connection, but it's not as flexible as some of the newer protocols have been designed around this. So I know Paul's going to go into a lot more detail about it, but this is an opportunity for us to introduce the idea that 3D Secure really refers to the family of protocols that are associated with connecting the consumer with their issuing bank. The protocol that's most prevalent in the marketplace today is 3DS version 1.0. And at the same time, you're going to hear a lot of news and information around the new version of 3D Secure, EMV 3DS version 2.1 and upcoming version 2.2. So version 2.1 is, you'll notice, by the way, I should mention, there's no 2.0. For a long time, when we were talking about EMV 3DS, we were talking about version 2.0, but 2.0 was never fully released into the marketplace. And so the first certified versions of EMV 3DS are version 2.1, and they're available in the marketplace today. They're going to give you some of the features from EMV 3DS that we're looking for, like, for example, some of the convenience and customer-friendly features that Paul's going to talk about. But we have the ability to include support for things like biometrics already in 2.1. Looking forward to 2.2, EMV 3DS version 2.2, which is going to be available early next year. We're going to have the capability to talk about implementing some of those exemptions that I mentioned in a previous slide. So with that introduction, I'd like to pass it back over to Paul, and Paul's going to give you some more information about EMV.
Thanks, Nick. So let's talk more about the actual benefits of EMV 3D Secure, the new generation of 3DS. Well, important EMV 3D Secure really represents an important advance in an effort to accelerate digital commerce with both fast and secure authentication. And of course, it's important to note that authentication always happens before authorization. And it does so in a collaborative process between both the merchant and the issuer. And given that authentication verifies the cardholder's identity, it in turn arms the issuer with more confidence to approve the transaction during authorization. So why would an issuing bank feel more confident in approving an authenticated transaction during authorization? Well, compared to 3DS 1.0, the new generation of EMV 3D Secure, the transaction contains much more data, many more fields of data, in fact, about 10 times more. Examples of such data include device information, geolocation, cardholder purchase behavior. So this enriched data is packaged up for the issuing bank to perform a risk assessment on the transaction. And this in turn creates a fast and secure authentication that results in fewer declined transactions, increased approvals, and improved cardholder trust, and overall a better shopping experience. So are we suggesting that the merchant do away with other fraud tools? Not at all. In fact, quite the opposite. EMV 3D Secure Authentication is really part of a layered approach and a balanced way to decrease fraud and increase approvals. Indeed, each fraud tool brings another dimension and more information about the consumer during the transaction. So again, this additional shared data helps authenticate the identity of the cardholder, and therefore the issuer can authorize with greater confidence. So to summarize, authentication is really a collaborative process between the merchant and the issuer, a team approach that improves the ecosystem as a whole. More shared data during a transaction provides greater dimension and context, and ultimately means better results. So EMV 3D Secure provides the issuers with more confidence they can use for authorization decisions. And finally, authentication is part of a layered defense against fraudsters approach. Much more data used and shared means fewer false declines and less friction, which improves the shopper's journey and results in a better experience. So, Nick, what are the next steps from a merchant's perspective?
Yeah, Paul, that's a good point. So, a lot of times we hear about PSD2, we hear about SCA. You know that there's regulations in place, and what are you supposed to do? What do you from a pragmatic standpoint? What are the actions that merchants are supposed to take? So we get that question all the time. We are here to help you with more detailed, of course, discussions around your specific needs. But in general, we're looking at two different paths. So those two paths depend on where you're at today. So if you're in a situation today where you do not have 3D Secure of any kind, remember we have multiple protocols. You may have technology that's already in place. You may be using that technology. You may not be using the technology. So there's a lot to consider. So if you're not using your 3D Secure at all today, well, as I mentioned several times, we're past the date. So there's no reason to wait. This should be a project that you have slated to work on it right away. So you have to work with your provider in order to understand what 3D Secure is going to look like inside of your purchase flow. So one of the things Paul mentioned was that 3D Secure becomes part of your strategy. So it becomes part of your purchase flow strategy. It becomes part of your fraud management strategy. And so now you have another layer to your authentication strategy with your 3DS provider. So that extra layer, or that additional layer of protection, requires some planning. So start the planning now, and select a provider that works with your payment services provider, and then implementation. So once you know where 3D Secure is going to fit in your transaction flow, before your fraud tool, after your fraud tool, is it the only thing you're going to do before authorization? You're going to run your risk analysis after. Once you've figured out essentially where it fits based on your flow, then you begin the implementation. Implementations vary, and it depends on exactly what you're trying to accomplish. EMV 3DS allows for implementations in desktop, in mobile applications, for SDKs, for example. There could be multiple facets to your solution design for your implementation. Again, work with your provider to get that design. The reason I bring that up is because now is the time to start. So we keep repeating ourselves. I know that we keep saying the same thing. But it's important that we take this opportunity, particularly as there have already been some extensions. We don't anticipate that there would be more time. Let's not find ourselves in the same sort of rush position to implement 3D Secure like a lot of merchants have earlier this year. So that's an opportunity today to start that process right away. And if we can get it done for the holiday season, a lot of folks have the opportunity to do that. So work with your provider to find out if it's possible to get it done before the holidays.
Okay, so just to reiterate, really, merchants should be implementing and not thinking about the PSD2 delays. It's in their better interest.
Certainly, counting on the delays is going to be a tricky proposition because it's a difficult and complex landscape to navigate. The safest solution is to have 3D Secure available so that you can meet SCA requirements for PSD2 now.
Right. Because you could have a merchant, let's say, based in the UK, where they have announced a delay, and most of their business is conducted in the UK, but they do conduct a certain amount of business in other European countries that may be subject to a different timeline.
That's correct.
Or some uncertainty.
That's right. So, you know, a lot of our merchants that I work with see the complexity of really dissecting the market as more so than the actual complexity of implementing 3D Secure. So that's a good way to look at it as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Great. So, you know, that's for folks that have no 3D Secure today. And you might think, well, if I have 3D Secure today, then I'm all set. But I would think this through as well. You've got the same or similar tasks. You need to move forward with your provider to analyze what your current strategy is in place today. A lot of 3D Secure strategies include some rules which could avoid 3D Secure in some cases. So you got to be careful. If you have rules like that in place, you might be running 3D Secure today, but bypassing 3D Secure for specific types of transactions. Well, now you need to look at those bypass rules in the context of the exact exemption strategy for PSD2 regulations. So you have to check on your implementation. Some folks have 3D Secure implemented, but they don't use it. So even if your implementation has been in place for some time, you haven't run testing against it, I would caution you against expecting to be able to just turn it on and have things running. Of course, it's worth testing and testing at scale as well. So reviewing the implementation is important, and then of course you got to review your fraud strategy and your tool set and make sure that in the context of 3D Secure, that you still have the right tools in place to meet the requirements as your company sees them. Okay, so let's kind of get to the summary here. So what's important is if you're on this webinar, if you're having this conversation with us, you realize the holidays, of course, are coming. Those holidays, that holiday season occurs every year, obviously, but the growth and peak in Europe is starting to follow some of the North American holiday standards and becoming more and more prevalent in terms of card not present peaking at the end of the calendar year for the holidays. If you can implement 3D Secure in time for those holidays, it's a time of higher volume, it's also a time of higher fraud, it's a time of lower margins, and as a result, fraud is more impactful. So just for the sake of the benefit of 3D Secure, for the opportunity for liability shift against fraud and to keep fraudsters out of the marketplace, merchants should be looking at that in time for the holidays. A takeaway here is when you hear about PSD2 and SCA for PSD2, 3D Secure solves for it. So when we're talking about what do I do as a merchant in terms of meeting SCA requirements, I need to have an implemented and tested 3D Secure solution. And of course, you can keep up to date on the latest in news. Now, I gave you some news updates about delays, but the details, you know, of course, I said the devil's in the details. You have an enormous number of press releases and ones applicable to the countries in which you have merchant acquiring are the ones that are probably most interesting to you. Check us out at payments.cardinalcommerce.com. Listed here to get the latest news on PSD2 and SCA. All right, so that's our wrap up, and I'm going to pass it over to Paul. And Paul's had his eyes open for some questions, and we'll see if you folks have any questions based on our webinar here.
Okay, thanks, Chris and Nick. So we did get a question from a Chris regarding exemptions. Wanting to know about exemptions. It seems quite complex. Can you maybe shed some more light on that?
Yeah. So, like my line has always been that you have to get into 3D Secure before you can get out of it. I have a lot of merchants, you know, in conversations that we hold that start by asking, okay, how do I start with exemptions for PSD2? And really, I think strategically the conversation has to go to, well, let's go back to what I just said before. Implement 3D Secure first. Let's make sure that you're meeting SCA requirements first. I've had hundreds of conversations with merchants, and I haven't run into one that has absolutely no exposure when they have merchant acquiring in Europe has absolutely no exposure to PSD2. Every business model has some exposure, even those that I mentioned in the out of scope category. Like for example, with the recurring transactions, there's still a portion of recurring transactions you're going to need to have 3D Secure for. The exemptions themselves, we get into a lot of details. The ones that are probably most likely to be brought into the marketplace relate to the low value transactions under 30 euros. But as I mentioned, there are some rules around that. And so for example, even if the transaction is under 30 euros, the ultimate decision is being made by the issuer as to whether or not they're going to run SCA. The issuer is keeping track of how many transactions are being run against a certain PAN for a certain consumer. And so the directive still tells them that they must run SCA every 5th transaction anyway. So I've had merchants that come to me and say, well, Nick, I've only got a transaction, every one of my transactions is under 30 euros by design, but you'll still have some exposure. As for the other exemptions for transaction risk analysis and for trusted listing or for whitelisting, those technologies are still being hammered out. So while we know in concept that those are allowed exemptions within SCA for PSD2, the issue is that the technology is still being laid out for merchants to take advantage of those. And there's a lot of discussion about that, but at the moment, you won't be able to find an implementation guide, for example, for how to be whitelisted across all the networks in a very simplistic or easy way. That's something that's ever evolving.
Yeah, and so really, I suppose merchants, it's in their best interest to keep communicating with their 3D Secure provider, whether it's CardinalCommerce or somebody else, or their payment service provider. As this evolves, then and more information is available, then discussing their unique cases, we can shed more context.
Yeah, and I think that the word evolution really makes sense here too, because although it wasn't the direct question, the concept of an evolving technology here is new. If you're very familiar with 3D Secure, you'll have a tendency toward thinking of it as a static protocol, particularly the EMV3, the first version of 3D Secure. EMV3DS is a different animal altogether, and it is evolving in concert with the regulatory evolution. So as the regulatory standards across the world change, in this case we're talking about PSD2, but as they change, so does EMV3DS, and new features and capabilities are being added. So you got to think about this as something that when you implement it today, you don't just forget about it. It's probably something you need to revisit periodically, annually, twice a year to make sure that the version of 3D Secure that you're running is meeting your needs, but is also addressing some of these, for example, exemption technologies that are evolving in the marketplace.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point that you made, that really the new normal going forward will be different from the past, in the sense that we're now talking about the second generation, but there's going to be different iterations, different versions. 2.1 is coming into effect, but then on the heels of that, as you said, 2.2, we know then, of course, 2.3 is already in the pipeline and will address specifically some SDK features. So, I think that is important for merchants to take stock of that and realize that the new normal going forward is an ever-evolving version of the technology.
Yeah, certainly.
Okay, we had another question in, not from Chris, from somebody else. They wanted to know, well, what happens if we don't use 3D Secure?
Yeah, that's a good question. So without using 3D Secure, particularly in Europe, well, so first of all, forgetting Europe for a moment, if we talk about not using 3D Secure in the marketplace, you don't get to take advantage of the protocol benefits. So 3D Secure protocol benefits outside of PSD2 include access to liability shift. So where merchants are authorizing with fully authenticated transactions, they have the ability to shift liability onto the issuer that authenticated the transaction. That's a huge benefit and is a huge risk mitigation tool for merchants. So that aside, if in a PSD2 environment in Europe we don't authenticate the transactions, then the issuers, based on the directive, the issuers are supposed to send a soft decline code to let you know that the transaction can't be authorized because of the lack of authentication. So the expectation is that as more and more players in the marketplace get their technology in place to meet PSD2 requirements for SCA, we're going to see a higher preponderance of soft declines related to lack of authentication. So that is expected to grow. So, it goes back to what we said with merchants before is get 3D Secure in place now, because we think the effects are only going to become more and more progressively more severe as some of these regulatory bodies, enforcement bodies that have delayed start enforcing in their district.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, another question just coming in, somewhat related to that, and I think we did discuss it a little bit earlier on. Why should I not just delay implementing 3D Secure now?
Yeah, sure.
And obviously, I think we addressed the fact that there could be the scenario in your particular country, in the UK, they've made a steadfast statement announcing an 18-month delay, but not so clear regarding other countries. And that's just the mandatory piece, right? But there could be other benefits that we discussed as well, PSD2 aside, why a merchant might want to put it into effect now.
Yeah, I mean, you said it. So first of all, not every country in the EEA has made an explicit statement of an extension. So we really don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty as to exactly when they will enforce and what those enforcement efforts will look like. Yeah. So, if merchants are interested in mitigating their risk, then 3D Secure now makes sense, implementing 3D Secure now. But there's probably an even stronger reason, and we've lived through it, so I made a little bit of a joke at the top of the webinar around making it through September 14th, and what making it through means is that a lot of merchants are rushing in order to get their systems implemented by the deadline. And we all know that if we're rushing toward a deadline at the last minute, that's going to have higher implementation costs. There's going to be a higher chance of your merchant side implementation having to be revisited afterwards. It's much better to have a structured and planned rollout. 18 months for some of these regions gives you the opportunity to budget and have anticipation for the implementation of 3D Secure. It also gives you the chance to have some iterations, meaning that the technology, particularly if you haven't implemented 3D Secure ever in the past, is going to require you to go back and forth and sort of say, okay, so what's my performance like? Are there any differences for different segments of my business? Is there anything else I need to take as a consideration based on the implementation of 3D Secure? You have 18 months to do all of that, but in order to get to that point, you have to have the basic plumbing in place as soon as possible.
Yeah. And added to that, the issuing banks are of course starting to upgrade to EMV 3D Secure, the new generation. And so as they come online, well, then that's an opportunity for you as a merchant to take advantage of that, correct?
Certainly, and the way to look at it is, particularly with EMV 3DS and a lot of the benefits that you outlined earlier, you're looking at a competitive advantage, or the potential for competitive. You're offering EMV 3DS authentication over a competitor that doesn't have it, then you're giving the opportunity to protect your consumer and give them a better experience than your competition. So a lot of merchants that talk to me are looking at EMV 3DS implementations as a way to win in the marketplace using technology.
Right, and I think you touched on it, a better experience, shopping experience. Can't underestimate that, and that's one of the areas where EMV 3D Secure really stands out. If you think of, for example, merchants that conduct a lot of business through mobile apps. Well, traditionally the old 3DS 1.0 really didn't support that. It was not a good experience. Whereas under EMV 3D Secure, that's quite different, right?
Yeah, and the experience is better and the implementation is better. And actually, I'm looking at some of the questions that have come up, and there was a question about the actual difficulty of the implementation. It's a good segue into that. So the difficulty of the implementation depends a lot on your landscape and who your provider is. And so depending on whether your provider has taken consideration in creating easy-to-use interfaces, and if they've created SDKs, as you're mentioning, for the mobile experience, if they've registered those SDKs with EMV code, the governing body for EMV3DS, those are really important considerations for the complexity of the implementation. For merchants of all sizes, there's lots of considerations as to exactly how they should implement EMV3DS. So if you're a small merchant, I would really encourage you to take a look at some of the shopping cart-based implementation methods through your shopping cart providers. A good resource for some information on that CardinalCommerce has is our site specifically geared toward shopping carts at PSD2.CardinalCommerce.com. Again, that's PSD2.CardinalCommerce.com. So that gives you an idea for smaller merchants that are using a off-the-shelf or shopping cart as a service provider. If you're using a custom implementation, particularly for our larger, mid-size, and enterprise merchants, then you have a series of different implementation options. 3D secure providers often give you more than one implementation choice because, particularly with EMV3DS, you have a requirement to sort of have two parts. One is to do the data gathering, and the other is to actually send the authentication request. And so sometimes those are one step, and sometimes those are split into two parts. And the data gathering has become more of a consideration, and some folks think of it as a more complexity because we have increased the amount of data that we're sharing with the issuers. So if you have 10 times the data, it's likely that you have 10 times the effort in acquiring that data from the session to the consumer. So again, if your 3D Secure provider gives you the tools to automatically do that data collection, then that's going to make your implementation a heck of a lot easier. And so again, I recommend you work with your provider to find out if there's help for data collection as well.
Okay, very good. We did also get a question regarding conversion rates based on the impact of 3D Secure. And I think that's often a hot topic, right? And certainly that we can provide more detailed information through signature of a non-disclosure agreement with our, either directly or with our payment service providers, our partners. But at a high level, certainly in Europe, yes, 3D Secure has traditionally had a very positive impact on conversion rates. And so really with the arrival of EMV 3D Secure and 10 times more data and even more collaboration between the issuers and the merchants, we strongly anticipate that to only increase.
Yeah, Paul, and just to piggyback on that, I would advise folks that are thinking about conversion rates to look at some of the resources that we have available on our website, and particularly in our blog about some of the authorization rate industry-based studies that we've released. It's not just Cardinal releasing these studies that come from other networks as well.
Absolutely.
And that you can take a look at what some of those performance numbers are. They contradict some of the sort of like common understanding of 3D Secure in the marketplace because we have approached in sort of this inflection point where we're seeing progressively better and better authorization performance. One other point to make here is when we look at overall performance, and I think the question was conversion rate. A lot of times conversion rate is thought of in a very narrow scope, so thinking about just the conversion of that portion of the transaction as it relates to 3D Secure, because some transactions won't be authenticated because for example, with SCA, they may not be able to perform the two-factor authentication. But when we look at conversion rates, we really think about it from the entire consumer experience standpoint. So start from the beginning of the checkout process all the way to fulfillment, and compare it to some of the alternatives where, sometimes there's some post-authorization declines by merchants and other negative consumer experiences where 3D Secure does help. So if you're thinking about the whole transaction and you think about conversion across the whole transaction, then some of the immediate changes right at the point of the authentication actually translate into an overall better experience for the bulk of your consumers.
that's critical. And of course, in terms of e-commerce, there's still that challenge, isn't there? There's that gap between conversion rates in the e-commerce world compared to the card present. And so it could be up to 15 percentage point difference. And so, again, that's where EMV 3 Secure, with the additional data, all delivered in a much more refined, slick, consumer-friendly way, can help close that gap.
That's definitely, this 3 Secure is definitely part of the strategy for closing that card not present to point of sale authorization gap.
Okay, well, very good. I don't believe we've any other questions, or, well, it looks like we have some questions, but looks like we may have run out of time. So we will certainly endeavor to respond to those questions in writing afterwards. And really, just to conclude, very much appreciate everyone for joining, and thank you, Nick. And
thank you, Paul.
And a very Merry Christmas to you.
Happy holidays.
Okay, thanks, everyone.